The Edinburgh Mystery. The man in the corner had not enjoyed his lunch. I could see that he had something on his mind, for even before he began the talk that morning, he was fidgeting with his bit of string, and settling all my nerves on John.
Have you ever felt real sympathy with a criminal or thief?
He asked after a while. Only once, I think, I replied, and then I'm not quite sure that it was the unfortunate woman who did enlist my sympathies was the criminal you make her out to be.
You mean the heroine of the new mystery?
He replied blandly.
I know that you tried very hard that time to discredit the only possible version of that mysterious murder, the version which is my own. Now, I am equally sure that you will have at the present moment no more notion as to who killed and robbed poor Lady Donaldson in Charlotte Square, Edinburgh, than the police have themselves. And yet you are fully prepared to pooh-pooh my arguments, and to disbelieve my version of the mystery. Such is a lady journalist's mind.
If you have some cock-and-bull story to explain that extraordinary case, I retorted, of course I shall disbelieve it. Certainly, if you're going to try and enlist my sympathies on behalf of Edith Crawford, I can assure you that you won't succeed.
Well, I don't know that that is altogether my intention. I see you are interested in the case, but I dare say you don't remember all the circumstances. You must forgive me if I repeat that which you already know. If you have ever been to Edinburgh at all, you will have heard of Graham's Bank and Mr. Andrew Graham, the present head of the firm. He's undoubtedly one of the most prominent nobilities of the modern Athens.
The man in the corner took 2 or 3 photos from his photo book and placed them before me, then pointed at them with his long bony finger.
That,
he said, is Mr. Elphinstone Graham, the eldest son, a typical young Scotchman, as you see, and this is David Graham, the second son. I looked closely over his last photo and saw before me a young face, upon which some lasting sorrow seemed already to have left its mark. The face was delicate and thin, the pinched features, and the eyes seemed almost unnaturally large and prominent.
He was deformed,
commented the man in the corner in answer to my thoughts.
And, as such, an object of pity and even the repugnance of most of his friends. There was also a good deal of talk in Edinburgh society as to his mental condition, his mind, according to many intimate friends of the Grahams, being at times decidedly unhinged. But, that as it may, I fancy that his life must have been a very sad one. He had lost his mother when quite a baby, and his father seemed, strangely enough, to have an almost unconquerable dislike towards him. Everybody got to know presently of David Graham's sad position in his father's own house, and also of his great affection lavished upon him by his godmother, Lady Donaldson, who was the sister of Mr. Graham's. She was a lady of considerable wealth, being the widow of Sir George Donaldson, the great distiller, but she seems to have been decidedly eccentric. Latterly, she had astonished all her family, who were rigid Presbyterians, by announcing her intention of embracing the Roman Catholic faith, and then retiring to the convent of St. Augustine's at New Abbots in Devonshire. She had a sole and absolute control of the vast fortune the doting husband had bequeathed to her. Clearly, therefore, she was at liberty to bestow it upon a Devonshire convent if she chose. But this evidently was not altogether her intention. I told you how fond she was of her deformed godson, did I not? Being a bundle of eccentrics, she had many hobbies, none more pronounced than the fixed determination to see, before retiring from the world altogether, David Graham happily married. Now it appears that David Graham, ugly, deformed, half demented as he was, had fallen desperately in love with Miss Edith Crawford, the daughter of the late Dr. Crawford of Prince's Gardens. The young lady, however, very naturally perhaps, thought shy of David Graham, who about the time certainly seemed very queer and morose. But Lady Donaldson, with characteristic determination, seems to have made up her mind to melt Miss Crawford's heart towards her unfortunate nephew. On October the 2nd, at a family party given by Mr. Graham in his fine mansion in Charlotte Square, Lady Donaldson openly announced her intention of making over, by deed of gift to her nephew, David Graham, certain property, money and shares, amounting in the total value to the sum of £100,000, and also her magnificent diamonds, which were said to be worth £50,000, for the use of, she said, David's wife. Keith McFinley, a lawyer of Prince Street, received the next day instructions of drawing up the necessary deed of gift, which she pledged herself to sign the day of her godson's wedding. A week later, the Scotsman contained the following paragraph. A marriage is arranged, and will shortly take place between David, younger son of Andrew Graham, Esquire, of Charlotte Square, Edinburgh, and Durstnakirk, Perthend, and Edith Lillian, only surviving daughter of the late Dr. Kenneth Crawford, of Prince's Gardens. In Edinburgh society, comments were loud and various upon the forthcoming marriage, and on the whole, comments were far from complimentary to the families concerned. I do not think that the Scotch are a particularly sentimental race, but there was such obvious buying, selling, and bargaining about this marriage that Scottish chivalry rose in revolt at the thought. Against that, the three people most concerned seemed perfectly satisfied. David Graham was positively transformed. His moroseness was gone from him, he lost his queer ways and wild manners, and became gentle and affectionate in the midst of his great and unexpected happiness. Miss Edith Crawford ordered her trousseau and talked of the diamonds to her friends. Lady Donaldson was only waiting for the consummation of the marriage, her heart's desire, before she finally retired from the world, at peace with it and with herself. The deed of gift was ready for the signature on the wedding day, which was fixed for November 7th, and Lady Donaldson took up her abode temporarily in her brother's house in Charlotte Square. Mr. Graham gave a large ball on October 23rd. Special interest was attracted to this ball from the fact that this occasion Lady Donaldson insisted that David's future wife should wear the magnificent diamonds which were soon to be hers. They were, it seems, superb, and became Miss Crawford's stately beauty to perfection. The ball was a brilliant success, the last guest leaving at 4 a.m. The next day it was a universal topic of conversation, and the day after that, when Edinburgh unfolded the late editions of the morning papers, it learned the horror and dismay. The Lady Donaldson had been found murdered in her room, and that the celebrated diamonds had been stolen. Hardly had the beautiful little city, however, recovered from this awful shock, than its newspapers had another thrilling sensation ready for their readers. Already all Scots and English papers had mysteriously hinted at startling information obtained by the procurator fiscal, and at an impending sensational arrest. Then the announcement came, and everyone in Edinburgh read, horror-struck and aghast, that the sensational arrest was none other than that of Miss Edith Crawford, for murder and robbery, both so daring and horrible that reasons refused to believe that the young lady, born and bred in the best social circle, could have conceived, much less executed, so heinous a crime. She had been arrested in London at the Midland Hotel and brought to Edinburgh, where she was judiciously examined, and bail was refused. Part 2. Little more than a fortnight after that, Edith Crawford was duly committed to stand her trial before the High Court of the Judiciary. She had pleaded not guilty at the pleading night, and her defense was entrusted to Sir James Fenwick, one of the most eminent advocates at the criminal bar. Strange to say,
Continued the man in the corner after a while,
public opinion from what the first went dead against this accused. The public was absolutely like a child, perfectly irresponsible and wholly illogical. It argued that since Miss Crawford had already been in the marriage contract with a half-demented, deformed creature for the sake of the £100,000, she must have been equally ready to murder and rob the old lady for the sake of £50,000 worth of jewelry, without the encumbrance of so undesirable a husband. Perhaps the great sympathy roused in the popular mind of David Graham had much to do with his ill feeling against the accused. David Graham had, by this cruel and dastardly murder, lost the best, if not the only, friend he possessed. He had also lost in one fell swoop the large fortune which Lady Donaldson had been about to assign to him. The deed of gift had never been signed, and the old lady's vast wealth, instead of enriching her favourite nephew, was distributed, since she had made no will, amongst her heirs-in-law. And now, to crown the long chapter of sorrow, David Graham saw that the girl he loved accused of an awful crime which had robbed him of his friend and his fortune. It was therefore with an unmistakable thrill that the righteous satisfaction of the Edinburgh society saw this mercenary girl in a terrible plight. I was immensely interested in the case and journeyed down to Edinburgh in order to get a view of the chief actors of the thrilling drama which was about to be unfolded there. I succeeded, I generally do, in securing one of the front seats in the audience, and was already comfortably installed in my place in court when through the trap-door I saw the head of a prisoner emerge. She was very becomingly distressed in deep black, and, led by two policemen, she took her place at the dock. Sir James Fenwick took hands with her very warmly, and I could almost hear him instilling words of comfort to her. The trial lasted 6 clear days, during which time more than 40 persons were examined for the prosecution, and as many for the defense. But the most interesting witnesses were certainly the 2 doctors, the maid Tremlett Campbell, and the High Street jeweller, and David Graham. There was, of course, a great deal of medical evidence to go through. Poor Lady Donaldson had been found with a silk scarf tied tightly around her neck, her face showing even in the inexperienced eye every symptom of strangulation. Then Tremlett, Lady Donaldson's confidential maid, was called. Closely examined by the Crown Counsel, she gave an account of the ball of Charlotte Square on the 23rd, and the wearing of the jewels by Miss Crawford on that occasion. "I helped Miss Crawford on with the tiara of her hair," she said, "and my lady put the 2 necklaces round Miss Crawford's neck herself. And there were also some beautiful brooches, bracelets, and earrings. At 4 o'clock in the morning, when the ball was over, Miss Crawford brought the jewels back to the lady's room. My lady had already gone to bed, and I had put out the electric light, and I was going too. There was only 1 candle left in the room, and it was close to the bed. Miss Crawford took all the jewels off and asked Lady Donaldson for the key to the safe so that she might put them away. My lady gave her the key and said to me, 'You can go to bed, Tremlett, and you must be dead tired.' I was glad to go, for I could hardly stand up, I was so tired. I said 'Good night' to my lady and also to Miss Crawford, who was busy putting away the jewels. I was going out of the room. I heard Lady Donaldson saying, 'Have you managed it, my dear?' And Miss Crawford said, 'I've put everything away very nicely.'" And as it's James Fenwick, Tremlett said that Lady Donaldson always carried the key in her jewel safe on a ribbon around her neck, and had done so the whole day preceding her death. "On the night of the 24th, she continued, Lady Donaldson was still rather tired and went up to her room directly after dinner, and while the family was still sitting in the dining-room. She made me dress her hair, then she slipped on her dressing-gown and sat in an armchair with a book.
She told me that she felt strangely uncomfortable and nervous and could not account for it. However, she did not want me to sit with her, so I thought that the best thing I could do was to tell Mr. David Graham that her ladyship did not seem very cheerful. Her ladyship was so fond of Mr. David, it always made her happy to have him with her. Then I went to my room at 8:30, and Mr. David called me. Said, "Your mistress does seem a little restless tonight. If I were you, I would just go and listen to her at the door for an hour's time, and if she has gone to bed, I would go away and stay with her until she was." At about 10 o'clock, I did as Mr. David suggested and listened at her ladyship's door. However, all was quiet in the room, and, thinking her ladyship had gone to sleep, I went back to bed. The next morning at 8 o'clock, when I took my mistress's cup of tea, I saw her lying on the floor, her poor dear face all purple and distorted. I screamed, and the other servants came rushing along. Then Mr. Graham had the door locked and sent for the doctor and the police. The poor woman seemed to find it very difficult not to break down. She was closely questioned by Sir James Fenwick, but had nothing further to say. She had seen her mistress alive at 8 o'clock in the evening on the 24th. "And then you listened at her door at 10 o'clock, asked Sir James. "Did you try to open it?" "I did, but it just locked," she replied. "Did Lady Donaldson usually lock her bedroom at night?" "Nearly always." "And in the morning when you took her tea?" "The door was open. I walked straight in." "Are you quite sure?" insisted Sir James. "Oh, swear it," solemnly answered the woman. After that, we were informed by several members of Mr. Graham's establishment that Miss Crawford had been in a tea to Charlotte Square in the afternoon of the 24th. That she told everyone she was going to London by the night mail, and she had some special shopping she wished to do there. It appears that Mr. Graham and David both tried to persuade her to stay for dinner, and then to go by the 9:10 p.m. from the Selonian station. Miss Crawford, however, had refused, saying that she always preferred to go with the Waverley station. It was near to her own rooms, and she still had a good deal of writing to do. In spite of these, 2 witnesses saw the accused in Charlotte Square later on in the evening. She was carrying a big bag which seemed heavy and was walking towards the Caledonian railway station. But the most thrilling moment in that sensational trial was reached on the second day, when David Graham, looking wretchedly ill, unkempt and haggard, stepped into the witness box. A murmur of sympathy went round the audience at the sight of him, who was the second, perhaps, most deeply stricken victim of the Charlotte Square tragedy. David Graham, in answer to the Crown Counsel, gave an account of his last view with Lady Donaldson. She told me she had seemed anxious and upset, and I went to have a chat with her. She soon cheered up, and the unfortunate young man hesitated visibly, but after a while resumed with obvious effort. She spoke of my marriage and of the gift she was about to bestow upon me. She said the diamonds would be for my wife, and after that, for my daughter, if I had one. She also complained that Mr. McFinley had been so punctilious about declaring the deed a gift, and that it was a great pity for £100,000 to just pass from her hands to mine without so much fuss. I stayed talking with her for about half an hour. Then I left her, as she seemed ready to go to bed, and I told her maid to listen at the door in about an hour's time. There was a deep silence in the court for a few moments, a silence which to me seemed almost electrical. If some time before it was uttered, the next question put by the Crown Counsel to the witness had hovered in the air. "You were engaged to Miss Elizabeth Crawford at one time, were you not?" One felt, rather than heard, the most inaudible yes which escaped from David Graham's compressed lips. "Under what circumstances was the engagement broken off?" Sir James Fenwick had already risen in protest, but David Graham had been the first to speak. I do not think that I need to answer that question. I will put it in a different form, then,
said the Crown Counsel urbanely.
one to which my learned friend cannot possibly take an exception. Did you or did you not, on October 27th, receive a letter from the accused in which she desired to be released from her promise of marriage to you?
Again, David Graham would have refused to answer, and he certainly gave no audible reply to the learned counsel's question. But everyone in the audience there present, aye, every member of the jury and of the bar, read upon David Graham's pale countenance and large, sorrowful eyes that ominous yes, which he failed to reach his trembling lips.
Part 3.
There was no doubt, continued the man in the corner, that what little sympathy the young girl's terrible position had aroused in the public mind had died out the moment that David Graham left the witness box on the second day of the trial. Whether Edith Crawford was guilty of murder or not, the callous way in which she had attempted and accepted her deformed lover, and then had thrown him over, had set everyone's mind against her. It was Graham himself who had been the first to put the prosecutor fiscal in the position of the fact that the accursed had written to David from London, breaking off her engagement. This information had, no doubt, directed the attention of the fiscal to Miss Crawford, and the police soon brought forward the evidence which had led her to arrest. We had a fiscal sensation on the third day when Mr. Campbell, jeweller of High Street, gave his evidence. He said that on October 25th, a lady came to his shop and offered to sell him a pair of diamond earrings. Trade had been very bad, and he had refused the bargain, although the lady seemed ready to part with the earrings for an extraordinarily low sum, considering the beauty of the stones. In fact, it was because of this evident desire on the lady's part to sell at any cost that he had looked at her more keenly than he otherwise would have done. He was now ready to swear that the lady that offered him the diamond earrings was the prisoner in the dock. I can assure you that as we listened to this apparently damnatory evidence, you might have heard a pin drop amongst the audience in the crowded court. The girl alone, there in the dock, remained calm and unmoved. Remember that for 2 days we had heard evidence to prove that old Dr. Crawford had died having his daughter penniless, that having no mother she had been brought up by a maiden aunt, who had trained her to be a governess, which occupation she had followed for several years, and that she certainly had never been known by any of her friends to be in the possession of solitaire diamond earrings. The prosecution had certainly secured an ace of trumps, but Sir James Fenwick, who during the whole of that day had seemed to take little interest in the proceedings, here rose from his seat, and I knew at once that he had got a titbit in the way of a point up his sleeve. Gaunt and usually tall, and with his beak-like nose, he always looks strangely impressive when he seriously tackles a witness. He did it at this time of the vengeance, I can tell you. He was all over the pompous little jeweler in a moment.
Had Mr. Campbell made a special entry in his book as to the visits of the lady in question? No. Had he any special means of ascertaining when the visits did actually take place? No, but what record had he of the visits?
Mr. Campbell had none. In fact, after about 20 minutes of cross-examination, he had to admit that he had given but little thought to the interview with the lady at the time, and certainly not with connection to the murder of Lady Donaldson, until he had read the papers that the young lady had been arrested. Then he and his clerk talked in the manner over, it appears, together, and had certainly recollected that the lady had brought some beautiful earrings for sale on a day which must have been the very morning after the murder. If Sir James Fenwick's object was to discredit the special witness, he certainly gained his point. All the pomposity went out of Mr. Campbell. He became flustered, and then excitedly when he lost his temper. After that he was allowed to leave the court, and Sir James Fenwick resumed his seat and waited, like a vulture for its prey. It presented itself in the person of Mr. Campbell's clerk, who, before the creator Festival, had cooperated his employer's evidence in every respect. In Scotland, no witness in any one case is present in court during the examination of another, and Mr. McFarlane, the clerk, was, therefore, quite unprepared for the pitfalls which Sir James Fenwick had prepared for him. He tumbled into them, head foremost, and with the eminent advocates turned him inside out like a glove. Mr. McFarlane did not lose his temper. He was far too humble a frame of mind to do that. But he got into a hopeless quagmire of mixed recollections, and he too left the witness box quite unprepared to swear to the day of the interview with the lady with the diamond earrings. I dare say, mind you, continued the man in the corner with a chuckle, that to most people present, Sir James Fenwick's cross-questioning seemed completely irrelevant. Both Mr. Campbell and his clerk were quite ready to swear that they had an interview concerning some diamond earrings with a lady, of whose identity with the accused they were perfectly well convinced. And to the casual observer, the question as to the time or even the day when the interviews took place could make but little difference in the ultimate issue. Now I took in a moment, the entire drift of Sir James Fenwick's defense for Edith Crawford. When Mr. McFarlane left the witness box, the second victim of the advocate's caustic tongue, I could read in the book the whole history of the crime, and its investigation and the mistakes made by the police first and the public prosecution afterwards. Sir James Fenwick knew them too, of course, and he placed a finger upon every one, demolishing, like a child who blows upon a house of cards, the entire scaffolding erected by the prosecution. Mr. Campbell's and Mr. McFarlane's identification of the accused with a lady who, on some date, admitted to be uncertain, had tried to sell a pair of diamond earrings was the first point. Sir James had plenty of witnesses to prove that on the 25th, the day after the murder, the accused was in London, whilst the day before Mr. Campbell's shop had been closed long before the family circle had last seen the Lady Donaldson. Clearly the jeweller and his clerk must not have seen her, and some other lady whom their vivid imagination had pictured being identical to the accused. Then came the great question of time. Mr. David Graham had been evidently the last to see Lady Donaldson alive. He had spoken to her as late as 8:30 p.m. Sir James Fenwick had called two porters of the Caledonian Railway Station who testified to Miss Crawford having taken her seat in a first-class carriage at 9:10 train, some minutes before it started. It was conceivable argued Sir James, that in place of a half an hour the accused, a young girl, could have found her way surreptitiously into the house at a time in which the entire household was still astir, that she would have strangled Lady Donaldson, forced open the safe, and made away with the jewels. A man, an experienced burglar, might have done it, but I contend that the accused is physically incapable of accomplishing such a feat. With regard to the broken engagement, continued the eminent counsel with a smile, it may have seemed a little heartless, certainly, but heartlessness is no crime in the eyes of the law. The accused had stated in her declaration at the time that she wrote to Mr. David Graham, breaking off her engagement, that she heard nothing of the Edinburgh tragedy. The London papers had reported the crime very briefly. The accused was very busy shopping. She knew nothing of Mr. David Graham's altered position. In no case was breaking off the engagement a proof that the accused had obtained possession of the jewels by so foul a deed. Of course, it is impossible for me, continued the man in the corner apologetically, to give you any idea of the eminent advocate's eloquence and the masterful logic. It struck every one, I think, just as it did me, that he chiefly directed the attention to the fact that there was absolutely no proof against the accused. Be that as it may, the result of the remarkable trial was a verdict of non-proven. The jury were absent 40 minutes, and it appears that in the mind of all of them there remained, in spite of Sir James's arguments, a firmly rooted conviction. call it instinct if you like, that Lady Edith Crawford had done away with Lady Donaldson in order to become possessed of those jewels, and that in spite of the pompous jeweler's many contradictions, she had offered him some of those diamonds for sale. But there was not enough proof to convict, and she was even given the benefit of the doubt. I have heard English people argue that in England she would have been hanged. Personally, I doubt that. I think that an English jury, not having the judicial loophole of not proven, would have been bound to acquit her. What do you think?
Part 4. There was a silence between us for a few moments, for I did not reply immediately, and he went on making impossible knots with his bits of string. Then I said, I think that I agree with those English people who say that the English jury would have condemned her. I have no doubt that she was guilty. She may not have committed the awful deed herself. Someone in Charlotte Square house may have been her accomplice and killed and robbed Lady Donaldson while Edith Crawford waited outside for the jewels. David Graham left his godmother at 8:30. If the accomplice was one of the servants of the house, he or she would have had plenty of time for any amount of villainy, and Edith Crawford could have yet caught the 9:10 train from Caledonia Station.
Then who, in your opinion?
Yes, sarcastically and cocking his funny bird-like head to the side.
Tried to sell the diamond earrings to Mr. Campbell, the jeweler.
Edith Crawford, of course, I retorted triumphantly. He and his clerk both recognized her.
When did she try to sell the earrings?
Ah, that is what I cannot quite make out, and there, to my mind, lies the only mystery in the case. On the 25th she certainly was in London, and it is not very likely that she could go back to Edinburgh in order to dispose of the jewels there, where they could most easily be traced.
Not very likely, certainly,
he assented dryly. And, I added, on the day before she left for London, Lady Donaldson was alive.
And pray,
he said suddenly, with the comic complacency he surveyed the beautiful knots he had just twisted up between his long fingers.
What has the fact got to do with it?
But it has everything to do with it, I retorted.
Ah, there you go.
He sighed with comic infinity.
My teachings don't seem to have improved your powers of reasoning. You are as bad as the police. Lady Donaldson has been robbed and murdered, and you immediately argue that she was robbed and murdered by the same person.
But, I argued.
There is no but, he said, getting more and more excited. See how simple it is. Edith Crawford wears the diamonds one night, then she brings them back to Lady Donaldson's room. Remember the maid's statement? My lady said, have you put them back, my dear? A simple statement utterly ignored by the prosecution. But what did it mean? That Lady Donaldson could not see for herself whether Edith Crawford put back the jewels or not, since she asked the question.
Then you argue?
I never argue, interrupted excitedly. I state undeniable facts. Edith Crawford wanted to steal the jewels, took them then and there. Then she had the opportunity. Why in the world should she have waited? Lady Donaldson was in bed, and Tremlett, the maid, had gone. The next day, namely the 25th, she tries to dispose of a pair of earrings to Mr. Campbell, and she fails, and decides to go to London, where she has a better chance. Sir James Fenwick did not think it desirable to bring forward witnesses to prove that, have since ascertained a fact, namely, that on the 27th of October, 3 days before her arrest, Lady Crawford crossed over to Belgium, and came back to London the next day. In Belgium, no doubt, Lady Donaldson's diamonds, taken out of their settings, calmly repose at this moment, while the money derived from their sale is safely deposited in a Belgian bank.
But then you murdered Lady Donaldson, and why? I gasped.
It was a daring, brutal murder, remember? Think of one who, not being the thief himself, would, nevertheless, have the strongest of all motives to shield the thief from the consequences of her own misdeeds. Since it would possibly be absolutely logical, nay, impossible, that he should be an accomplice.
Surely, I gasped.
Think of a curious nature, warped morality as well as physical. Do you know how those natures feel? 1,000 times more strongly than even straight natures in everyday life. Then think of such a nature being brought face to face with this awful problem. Do you think that for such nature would hesitate a moment before committing a crime to save the loved one from the consequences of a deed? Mind you, I don't ascertain for a moment that David Graham had any intention of murdering Lady Donaldson. Charlotte tells him that she seems strangely upset. He goes to her room and finds out that she discovered that she had been robbed. She naturally suspects Edith Crawford, recollects the incidents of the night before, and probably expresses her feelings to David Graham, and threatens imminent persecution. Scandal, what you will. I repeat it again. I dare say he had no wish to kill her. Probably he merely threatened to. A medical gentleman who spoke of a sudden heart failure was no doubt right. Then imagine David Graham's remorse, his horror, and his fears. An empty safe probably is the first object that suggests to him the grim tableau of robbery and murder, which he arranges in order to ensure his own safety. But remember one thing. No miscreant was ever seen to enter or leave the house surreptitiously. The murderer left no signs of entrance and none of exit. An armed burglar would have left some trace. Someone would have heard something. Then who locked and unlocked Lady Donaldson's door that night, while she herself lay dead? Someone in the house, I tell you. Someone who left no trace. Someone against whom there would be no suspicion. Someone who killed without apparently the slightest premeditation and without the slightest motive. Think of it. I know I am right, and then tell me if I have enlisted all your sympathies in the author of the Edinburgh murders.
And he was gone. I looked again at the photo of David Graham. Did a crooked mind really dwell in that crooked body? And were there in the world such crimes that were great enough to be deemed sublime?